Hello, everyone, and welcome to my Bake Along series where I do just that. Bake so you can bake along with me. And today's recipe is a request from you. I do read the comments, and I've had a few bakers ask for a ciabatta recipe. So I am making ciabatta bread. Now, ciabatta is a flat, crusty bread with nice big holes in the interior. It's actually quite different than focaccia, which is a softer style bread. It's got a softer crust to it. In fact, it doesn't have a crust at all. But to get this ciabatta bread takes making first a starter, not a sourdough starter. All sourdough starters are starters, but not all starters are sourdough. This is called a biga, and it's more of a thicker style starter. So I've got my whole wheat flour and some bread flour. And I like to add a little whole wheat flour in my starter whenever I'm making a starter, because you've got the whole grain for the yeast to feed on. I find it really lends a delicious flavor and just a subtle texture difference to the bread itself once it's baked. I will also add, I've got my scale here, half a cup of water. I'm just going to weigh that in just because it's faster. There we go. And a biga, this style of starter, takes a pinch of commercial yeast, just baker's yeast. This is an instant yeast, but just a pinch. Now, when you'll see when I stir this together that it's going to be very dense and thick. And this is what defines a biga, this sort of thick paste that starts out so heavy and dense like this. And you don't have to knead it or do anything fancy. Just make sure you can't see any visible bits of flour anymore. So to take a second, the difference between a biga, a levain, and a poulish is really to do with moisture content. So a biga is dense and thick. A poulish is on the other side, where it is really wet and sloppy and not even a dough itself. And a levain sits in the middle. Both a poulish and a biga take a pinch of yeast, where a levain typically just counts on airborne yeast to start fermenting. So a biga and a poulish you can use within 12 to 18 hours of making it, where a levain is that sourdough style starter where you let it go for days and days, even weeks and weeks, and feed it repeatedly. But the biga means you can be making your bread within 12 to 18 hours. So I'm just going to transfer this to a container, and I really want you to see the difference between the before and after over the course of 18 hours. So this is the biga I made yesterday, and it's hard to imagine that that lump of thick dough turns into this on the kitchen counter after 12 to 18 hours, but that is what happens. So this is what I'm ready to use, and I guess I'm going to be making some more ciabatta tomorrow. I'll set that aside. And so once you've got your biga, you're ready to make your dough. And because even though it's relaxed and risen, you can see all the active bubbles in there, you need to break it down a little bit. So I'm going to first loosen the biga in my water for the dough recipe. And you see the full measurements and step-by-step instructions for this entire recipe is right below the window. If you see the More button, click on that and it opens up the full recipe. So we'll tear this out and I'll measure in. This is lukewarm water. Because the dough takes so long to sit, I'm not that specific about how warm it has to be. I just have to calculate 580 ml. You just don't want it hot. Getting close. There we go. And now I will just grab another spoon and spoon this, now soft but still thick, Biga into the bowl. And with this bread dough recipe, I want you to get ready to get your hands in there. The best thing for you to do is actually get in there and kind of break down the Biga. It's not going to dissolve fully in the water. So I would describe the water temperature as just above body temperature, since lukewarm can be a bit of a vague term. So once you see your water go cloudy and your Biga's in some thicker pieces, then you're ready to measure in your flour. And I am using bread flour in this recipe because we want that protein to build and bond the dough together. There we go. So I'm just going to scoop that in. Just a little more, 485 grams. I do have the full volume measurements too, but it is a good habit. If you're making a lot of bread these days, get in the habit of weighing. You'll just find you get a more consistent result. Each batch you make, you'll find it's more consistent. That, and then the last thing I need before I add my salt is yeast. So even though the Biga has some yeast, I'm going to bolster it with 1.5 teaspoons. Take my wooden spoon. This is a bread. You could call it a no-knead bread, but it's relying on the moisture and an enzymatic process called Autolyse, where as the hydrated flour sits in this wet, sloppy mix, it starts, the proteins start bonding just because of the moisture without salt. So you'll notice I haven't added salt to the dough yet because I want to take advantage, even just 15 to 20 minutes, letting the dough sit at this point. So all we've got is the Biga, water, flour, and yeast added to this. And so what I do is over 15 minutes, it's not going to dry out. I just leave it uncovered, walk away, take care of some other things, come back in 15 minutes, and then you can add your salt. And I have one ready. Oh, I'm gonna have so much bread hanging around. I'm gonna need my spoon. So you won't notice a lot of change looking at the dough. And I have my 2 teaspoons of coarse salt. But the minute you start stirring it, you'll notice it has a different type of stretchiness to it. Let me bring back that other one just so you can get a sense. So this is the exact same dough 15 minutes later, and see how you can see the elastic bands in there compared to the sloppy mess I just assembled. That's the protein development. That's what's going to keep these nice airy holes. And what I like to do is take a minute or two with the wooden spoon, or if you have a bowl scraper, just really get in there and kind of work the dough a little bit. You'll never be able to turn it out onto a work surface and knead it, and it's not expected. So just like this for a minute or two, but I can see I've got these nice elastic bands pulling away as I pull the dough. So it's ready to set aside. So at this point, you give it 2 hours. Cover the bowl and let it rise. Just let it do its thing. Because it's so wet, you won't see it change a lot, but you will notice lots of bubbles developing. This is a dough, 2 hours old now, and you can see those beautiful big holes. There's a lift to it. There's a nice shine to the dough. And now, this is where it's time to shape it. A ciabatta is distinctively flat and uneven in shape. It leaves lots of surface area so you can develop a really, really good crust to it. When you're working with the flour, it's going to get really sticky and messy. So you want to have lots of flour on hand for your work surface and your hands. So a generous flouring. And while I've got the flour, I've got my 2 baking trays. You want to sprinkle your parchment-lined baking trays with lots of flour. This recipe makes 2 ciabatta breads. And ciabatta freezes wonderfully well. Okay, and lots of flour for my hands. This is the best part. This is why you're going to want to make this recipe. Look at that beautiful stretchiness. Oh, love it, love it, love it, love it. Nice, generous sprinkling of flour on top. Now we're not going to shape or round this bread. We want to work with it in this sort of messy, uneven shape. So I'm going to slide this one out of the way. I don't want to knock down the air within the ciabatta. So what you can do is either using a bench scraper or a bowl scraper or even just your 2 hands. Whoop! Lift it onto your baking tray. And it's really kind of silky feeling. You want to stretch it a little bit. I kind of go for an 8 by 12 shape, but do not pull the ruler out for this recipe. And I'll do the same for this loaf. You can see I'm not tucking the dough under, I'm not shaping or rounding it, which is why the surface flour, use as much as you need because it's not going to get worked into the dough itself. There we go. I love seeing these big bubbles there. Doesn't that look fantastic? Ugh. Now what you want to do after you shape it at this point, because they're so sticky, don't try and cover them with a tea towel. The tea towel will just stick. What you want to do is just leave these on the counter for about half an hour, and then they're ready for the oven. Give your oven plenty of time to heat up because you need to heat it to 450 Fahrenheit. So really, really hot, but you don't have to do anything else to the bread. I'm going to set that aside. I have 2 that have had 30 minutes to sit, and they're ready to go. When I press with my finger and an indentation stays, then I know it's ready for the oven. So, like so, but this isn't focaccia where I'm going to dimple it with my hands. It's actually going to go in the oven just like this. Nothing else to do. There we go. And that bread takes about 30 minutes in that 450 oven. And what I like to do at that point is shut off the oven so the oven starts cooling down slowly, and that just finishes the crust. So you get a nice crust on your bread. There we go. And of course, I've pulled some just from the oven right before we started taping. So I've got warm bread to show you. There we go. Look at that ciabatta. It gets, with that hot oven, that beautiful color, a nice crust to it. And then, of course, let's take a look inside. Where's my knife? We've got bits of flour and bowls, and I have to keep track of now everything I've made in its different stages so that I can keep baking as soon as we stop taping here. There. Oh, that's what I want to see, that beautiful airiness inside. This is such a good recipe. And it's got a good tear to it. Oh, a delicious crust. That was my baking tray that just went bonk inside the oven. Oh, this is such a good bread. And if you're new to bread baking, start with this because you don't need mixers, you don't need a big enamel pot, you don't need fancy tools, you just need some bread, flour, some counter space, and an oven that can heat up really, really hot, and you're going to be making ciabatta before you know it. I thank you for joining me. I hope I've given you all the tips to give you the confidence to try this recipe, and I'll be back soon with another delicious bake-along for you. Have a great week, everyone. The crunch.